Нашого міжнародного експертного обговорення програми «ЮЛІТ з Європою 2021», яке цього року називається «Партнерство для розвитку». Я нагадаю, що це вже другий день нашої конференції. Мене звати Ніна Кур'ята, я українська медіаекспертка і з задоволенням модерую для вас цю цікаву дискусію. Ми розпочинаємо роботу заключного дня нашого експертного обговорення, де поговоримо про дуже важливі речі. Наприклад, про адміністративну спроможність наших місцевих громад, яка б дозволила їм здійснити всі ті проекти, про які вони мріють. Ми вчора багато про це чули від наших гостей. Також ми поговоримо про те, щоб ставати ближчими до європейських стандартів на усіх рівнях, починаючи з того, щоб середовище довкола нас було комфортнішим та чистішим, та закінчуючи тим, щоб надавати мешканцям громад різноманітні цифрові послуги. Учора з нами на зв'язку було більше 300 людей. Я нагадаю, що так само, як і вчора, так і сьогодні, працюють канали синхронного перекладу, а також паралельні сесії під назвою «Запитай експерта», де ви можете ставити свої питання про ваші конкретні мрії, бажання, проекти, які б ви хотіли втілити, і наші експерти з задоволенням нададуть вам відповідь. Ключова сесія сьогодні присвячена тому, як місцеві громади можуть підвищити свою адміністративну спроможність, щоб здійснити свої проекти. Ця сесія триватиме до 10:45, а промодерує її керівниця сектору регіонального та місцевого розвитку представництва Європейського Союзу в Україні Наталія Старостенко. Прошу, пані Наталю.
Дякую, пані Ніна. Dear participants, let me welcome you on behalf of the European Union delegation to Ukraine and thank you Lead with Europe program for organization of annual international expert exchanges, which have become very important, useful and popular platform for discussion of crucial issues for local economic development. Decentralization features prominently in the European Union's support to Ukraine. Completed amalgamation was a very important step, but only the first step. And now it's very important for the government structures to be filled in with contents and with adequate financial resources. Strengthened local decision-making powers and increased flexibility in investment decisions. Undoubtedly, local leaders and institutions will play a crucial role in this process. On a daily basis, they face a lot of dilemmas and choices. And many of these choices are related to municipal financing and investment decisions. However, one choice is almost inevitable now. Efficient partnerships strengthen the development. We are stronger together. We are glad that you Lead with Europe promotes municipal partnerships and raised this very important topic, partnerships for development for Ukraine. You Lead, funded by European Union and its member states, Denmark, Estonia, Germany, Poland, Slovenia and Sweden, is one of the biggest and certainly the most successful technical cooperation programs worldwide. You Lead is first and foremost an international expert hub, working with prominent scientists and practitioners from different countries. It is an honor for me to introduce Professor Andres Rodriguez-Pozet today, who is one of the most cutting-edge researchers worldwide. He works in the fields of economic geography, urban and regional planning. We are happy to have him with us today because his research topics are very relevant for Ukraine. Specifically, why some territories prosper and others not? How variations in the quality of institutions determine the economic trajectory of cities and regions? What is the role of migration and others? In 2021, he was named one more time among the most cited scientists worldwide. And it's a pleasure to note that he contributes his knowledge to the work of international organizations, such as the European Commission, World Bank, different United Nations agencies, OECD, and others. Mr. Rodriguez-Pozet, the floor is yours, and we are very much looking forward to your presentation. You are most welcome. Thank you.
Зараз, поки невелика технічна затримка, яку, я сподіваюся, наша команда скоро владнає. Я вам хочу нагадати одну цікаву річ. Ми вчора говорили про те, що в рамках програми «Юліт з Європою» було відібрано 32 місцеві проєкти. Так от, хороша новина полягає в тому, що всі ці проєкти ви вже можете побачити на сайті. Прошу. Коли у вас буде час, обов'язково туди зайдіть і почитайте. Може, вас це надихне на якісь власні нові ідеї. А зараз ми чекаємо на зв'язок. Колеги, ми раді повідомити, що невеликі технічні заминки.
Dear colleagues, we are glad to announce the technical glitches are over and our special keynote speaker is live on air. Dear Natalia, please, now we can hear each other. Let us reintroduce our keynote speaker.
Pleasure and honor for us to have Professor Andres Rodriguez-Poze with us today. And you're most welcome, and the floor is yours.
Здравствуйте, and thank you very much, Natalia. I hope that now you can hear me and that the technical problems have been resolved. If you can then ask the slides to be put, I have some slides for the presentation today. Okay, thank you very much. It's my absolute pleasure to be here with you to talk about an issue of which I think is crucial importance to the Ukraine, which is the whole idea of how institutional and administrative capacities and their contribution can contribute to the success of municipal investment projects. They can contribute to actually to promote local economic development wherever you are and wherever you live in the Ukraine. If we can go to the next slide, please. I'm going to highlight, and Natalia has highlighted this earlier, that the process that the Ukraine has undergone with amalgamation and greater decentralization is not unique to the Ukraine. It is a global trend. And if we can go to the next slide, please. Decentralization is happening all over the world. And why is it happening? It is happening because traditionally, or what we have seen for many reasons are related to identity, for example, the need to preserve, to promote local culture. But there's also a very important economic reason that traditional development strategies in the past had failed in many respects. What we had was top-down development strategies, very often based on infrastructure, on large industrial policies, or in interventions that were trying to attract foreign direct investment, and that in many cases had generally created sheltered economies, they had created high-tech fantasies, and that also had not delivered in places like the Mezzogiorno or in Brazil, or even at the beginning of the European cohesion policy that has improved significantly in recent years, the intended objectives of greater economic development. So we can go to the next slide. So decentralization in this respect has been sold as a panacea for economic development. Why? Because first, it implies greater transfers of greater resources to resources and powers to cities and regions. It also allows for the possibility to match policy to the local provision, to the provision of local demand. So you have a much better tailoring of policy to the needs of different places wherever you live, and to different places, for example, in the Ukraine. And it also leverages the information advantage of some national governments. It does empower the people who live there, the local actors, what we know as the local stakeholders, to actually make decisions that concern their own future, rather than these decisions being made from distant decision makers in the capital. If we go to the next slide, please. However, decentralization cannot just be considered a panacea, because it is not immune to problems, it is not immune to pitfalls. What we have seen is that in the past, when many countries have decentralized, especially if they have decentralized hastily without any sort of particular concern to the local institutions, it has contributed to higher regional and income disparities, with more developed regions with greater capabilities being able to steam ahead where others lag behind. And it has often been the case that it could, or it has led to social fragmentation and corruption. So next slide, please. What about the Ukrainian experience? Where can we put the situation and the transformation, the whole process that the Ukraine has undergone in this global situation of this global drive towards decentralization? Please. In the Ukraine, what we have seen has been, as was mentioned by Natalia, a very important transformation in recent years. The concept framework of reform of local self-government and the territorial organization of power of 2014 and the stated strategy for regional development that has been developed between 2015 and 2020 was a very, very important first step. In this respect, Ukraine went the extra mile relative to other parts of the world. It implied a significant territorial reform with the merger or the amalgamation of 12,000 previous local governments into 1,470 bigger municipalities. It promoted the devolution, so the decentralization of tasks and resources that actually empower local communities with a significant capacity to pursue their own policies. And it also facilitated the implementation in a country that was traditionally highly centralized as the Ukraine of regional and local development policy, executing intervention at the scale, the territorial scale that is probably the most adequate to promote socioeconomic development. However, as this was happening, there has been, like in many other parts of Europe and many other parts of the world, a concentration of economic activity in certain parts of the country, very often at the expense, if you can say like that, of other areas of the Ukraine. GDP growth has become increasingly concentrated in a handful of western and central western regions of the country, and especially in the capital, in Kiev. So if we can go to the next slide, here the question is, how can we then make sure that without undermining the growth in Kiev and in the western and northwestern areas of the country, other parts of the Ukraine can benefit and can benefit significantly from this process of territorial amalgamation of local authorities and from the possibility and the potential that devolution offers for local economic development. And this all comes down to the role of local institutions. When you decentralize and if you have relatively well-functioning institutions, what you create is the mechanisms to improve trust within the community and reduce the transaction cost of any sort of economic activity through better policies. This actually leads to an increase in the learning capacity, to a better and easier fulfillment of contracts, to creating rules of the game that are transparent and efficient for all. And this drives a cooperation among firms, networks, and the promotion of greater trade and interaction with other parts of the Ukraine, but also with other parts of the world. So if we go to the next slide, please. But there's a big issue that in order for decentralization and this devolution of powers and resources to subnational tiers of government, to Ukrainian municipalities, that the institutional capacity is there. And in all this reform, there has been an important missing link, which is the focus on institutional quality. There's considerable evidence that amalgamation in the Ukraine has failed to create the administrative bodies with enough capacity to tackle the challenges linked to decentralized governments, while already, as has been highlighted by the OECD, adding to what is a somewhat jumbled, somewhat complicated allocation of responsibilities across different levels of governance in the country. Therefore, there's an urgent need, if the Ukraine is going to make the most of the amalgamation of local municipalities, the decentralization process that it has undertaken in the last 6 to 7 years, and of any sort of intervention at municipal level, that institutional quality is brought to the center. But the question is, which levers in terms of improving institutional quality need to be acted upon? And this is where, if we go to the next slide, the international experience, what has happened elsewhere in the world, can serve as a guide for what the situation in the Ukraine is and where the Ukraine can actually improve in order to make the most, to optimize this whole and very, very important, very bold administrative reform. So we go to the next slide. I'm going to highlight that the problems of institutions are not exclusive to the Ukraine. They happen everywhere. In Europe, in recent years, we have spent in the European Union, more specifically, quite a lot of resources in order to try to understand differences in the quality of institutions. And you can see there different measurements that come from the work that has been done fundamentally at the behest of the European Commission by the Quality of Government Institute at the University of Gothenburg, in which there has been an analysis of the quality of government of subnational governments. And you can see that there are significant variations across the whole of Europe. You have areas of Europe, mostly in the Nordic countries, places like Denmark, Sweden, or Finland, where the quality of subnational government is absolutely excellent, and it does facilitate the implementation of transparent, of efficient, of measures, interventions that are very well targeted to the needs of every specific place. But unfortunately, places like the Nordics or other regions that have also excellent quality of government are the exception. There are other parts of Europe, fundamentally in Southeastern Europe, covering many parts of countries like Romania, Bulgaria, but also Greece, Croatia, or the south of Italy, where the quality of government could be significantly improved at the regional and even at the municipal level. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Here, what we have is that institutions act as a conditioning factor. Not this slide, the next one. Institutions actually act as a conditioning factor, and having weak institutions, as we have seen in the southeast of Europe, in parts of southern Italy, actually has important effects because they mediate the effectiveness of development policies through factors like, for example, you have a far weaker rule of law, you might have higher levels of corruption, you have local administrations and local bureaucracies that are subpar and therefore need a boost in technical capacities, in capacities of leadership. And you might have weak or unsustainable institutions. So if we go to the next slide, if you have those conditions, you end up in a situation whereby the impact of institutional and administrative capacities on the delivery of these local policies that are now going to be much more implemented by the amalgamated local governments might have significant direct and indirect negative impacts on economic outcomes. Said in other words, I'm going to try to show how in this case of the European Union, in places where you have significantly weak institutions, the impact of policies is greatly diminished. So we go to the next slide, please. Here is some analysis of, I'm going to take a look first at the direct impact of institutions, devolved institutions, on economic development, and then I'm going to look at the indirect. Here is some analysis that comes from a very deep empirical analysis of the quality of government and its impact on economic growth at the level of European Union, there's a regression table. You don't need to understand all the factors behind that. But what I want to highlight is to look at the red rectangle at the top, which highlights that in places in the European Union where the quality of government is significantly higher, there is a much better capacity for first to innovate, but also to grow. That if you have a higher quality of government directly, it facilitates very much the promotion of all factors, whether it is employment or productivity or innovation or just pure growth, that lead to greater economic development. And if we can go to the next slide, please. This implies, just to give you an idea, that in levels, in places where you have significantly high quality of government, which is represented by the red line there, you have levels of growth that are on average 15 to 20%, depending on your level of expenditure on actual development, 15 to 20% higher than in places with low quality of government. If we go to the next slide, please. This is then translated very much into far higher levels, not just of growth, but it gives you an indication that pumping money and putting resources into places with low quality of government does increase economic development to a relatively limited extent. If you put the same effort of improving quality of government, you get, on average, 3 to 4 times higher levels of growth than if you just focus on putting more resources. So what is becoming clear now in the case of the European Union is that we need more resources, especially to promote those areas of Europe where you have a lower level of development, or you have areas that are stuck in a development trap. But you get far more returns if you combine that with a significant effort to improve the quality of government. If we can go to the next slide, please. On top of that, there's also a direct impact, as I was mentioning, on other factors, on employment. Research I have done with Marco Di Cataldo highlights very clearly that if you have better quality of government, you have much more employment growth and much greater social inclusion. But it's not just the type of research I have been doing. David Aldrich and Maxim Belitsky, for example, have also linked higher quality of government with the capacity to create a much more dynamic entrepreneurial ecosystem. So, and if we can go to the next slide, please. But also, weak quality of government actually affects or has an indirect impact because it affects the delivery of other types of policy, whether it is infrastructure policy or innovation policy, or let's say in foreign direct investment policy. All these policies are highly affected by quality of government. This is what has happened, for example, in countries like Portugal or in Spain, that very often poor, let's say, weaker institutions have actually led to infrastructure investments that were not the optimal type of investments. Sometimes there were grant investments because there was money, there were resources available, very often coming from the European Union. But on the whole, this led to lower levels of growth. And this is something, if we go to the next slide, that has been highlighted here. You have a map of levels of growth and investment in infrastructure across Europe, which is highlighted by the signs that you see of roads. And you have had very high levels of investment in places like Portugal, in this case in motorways, in places like Spain, in central France, or in, for example, in parts of Hungary. But the problem has been that, if we go to the next slide, that the returns of these investments have been below and well below expectations. What we find here, and this is also from an analysis that I did with Marco Di Cataldo and Riccardo Crescenzi, is that, again, as mentioned before, the impact on economic growth of having better quality of government is higher than putting more infrastructure, but that both factors combine together. That in places where you have invested the most in infrastructure and you had a higher quality of government, decisions on what type of infrastructure to invest were far higher, and the better the institutional quality and the higher the investment in local roads led to a more adequate type of investment in infrastructure, and as a result of that, to a higher level of growth in terms of GDP. So we can go to the next slide. Another important factor is the indirect impact of high quality of government on innovation policies. As we can see here, in most cases, most people think innovation policy is about investing in R&D, and investing in R&D makes a big difference. But we can see clearly that for most regions in Europe, when you have a quality of government that is below at levels that is between 30% and 80% of the quality of government that we find in Europe, so the bulk of regions of the European Union, we find that putting much more money into research and development without improving the quality of government actually leads results that are less and well less than expected. So on the whole, and if we go to the next slide, if you decentralize without paying attention to the institutional quality, if you decentralize in a low institutional quality environment, you end up with, like that table over there, strategies of development that are highly unbalanced, in which you might promote one sort of dimension at the expense of other dimensions. And when you have a table based on only 2 legs or 3 legs, that table is going to fall. You're not going to achieve the development objectives that you wanted to achieve. You might also end up with high-tech fantasies. As we saw, for example, in the case of infrastructure, what the tendency by decentralized governments that very often don't have the capacity to do it is just not to invest on improving on what you already have, but also to try to make a jump saying we can become overnight another Silicon Valley, to go for very ambitious projects which are completely detached from the local economic and socio-economic and even institutional ecosystem. So you end up with the idea that you have grand plans, but the returns of those plans are weak because you're investing something which is completely disconnected from the local economic ecosystem. And then it creates a big opportunity cost because it prevents from investing in other areas and in other sort of interventions, which might be much more connected to the local ecosystem, that then end up not working adequately. So we can go to the next example. So what are the implications? What can we go and now zoom in this experience? What are the implications for the Ukraine? And if we go into the next slide, we need to think about the type of decentralization. At the moment, whether fiscal decentralization, where the process of fiscal and political decentralization that the Ukraine has undertaken will work or not, would depend very much on not just factors of institutional quality, but on how you get your own resources. And here, research that I have done with Anne Kreuger indicates that in the case of Central and Eastern Europe, like in many other parts of the world, what we are finding is that generally, if you have a fiscally decentralized system that is very much linked to local taxation, in which there's a direct link between those people being taxed and the people taking the decisions at the local level for, let's say, promoting public policies, you end up with systems that are much more transparent, that are much more accountable, and that in most cases lead to greater economic efficiency. When you have, as has been the case in many parts of Central and Eastern Europe in the past, subnational systems or systems of subnational expenditure which very much depend on transfers, in which the taxes are levied by the capital and then sent back to the localities, thus breaking the direct link between those tax and those taking over the taxation, you end up with far lower transparency, far lower accountability, and lower efficiency overall. So if we go to the next slide, in the end, decentralization and promoting decentralization was, as was highlighted by Natalia, a first step. Because without improving the institutions that surround that process of decentralization, you're going to end up with a strategy that might not work. In the end, this is like a bicycle. You need to have a level of intervention in which not only the strategy counts, but the quality of the institutions that are going to design, implement, and monitor that strategy is as important, if not more important, than the strategy. So if we go to the next slide, please. But the question is, what type of institutions? First of all, we need institution building in the case of the Ukraine, but also elsewhere, as we have seen and has been implemented in many parts of Europe. In order to achieve greater development and make the most of limited resources, institution building is essential. But we need to go beyond this idea of one size fits all, that intervention should be the same everywhere because it's going to be counterproductive. We need policies that are adapted to the conditions of different places. We need to invest in capacity building in these areas in order to understand better local conditions. And this requires efficient institutions at all levels, and especially at the local and municipal levels. But it doesn't imply that we need a tailor-made sort of strategy for every municipality. Because if we do that, this is going to be difficult to implement and monitor. At all levels in the Ukrainian state, there's a need to define clear guidelines for development and institutional intervention, guidelines for what is needed to be done in terms of capacity building, guidelines for increasing transparency and accountability, guidelines for facilitating the participation of stakeholders at the local level, guidelines for minimizing problems of corruption that are endemic in certain parts of the country, leaving sufficient leeway to the adapting to differences in local conditions and differences in local economic and social ecosystems. So we go to the next slide. And this is something that has been achieved successfully in different parts of Europe. One example has been the increase of participation in the case of Estonia, which is one of the most dynamic countries in the European Union in many ways. And this has been in order to increase participation and transparency, has been the promotion of e-government services at the local level. In which all local government agencies, persons in public law, as well as all those in private law, have to accept digitally signed documents. So this has also undermined the process of corruption that was pervasive not that long ago in a country like Estonia. And that has facilitated, in many ways to reduce political inequality, but also has increased trust significantly and participations of citizens in less developed areas of Estonia, making sure that as a whole, the whole country has benefited from much greater, much more transparent, much more efficient institutions. If we go to the next slide, we have another similar case in the case of the Basque Country, a part of Spain that has the highest level of autonomy and one of the highest levels of autonomy in the world, in which, despite that, was suffering and had significant problems until the late 2000s, around 2012, where it was realized that it was stagnating from an economic and an innovation perspective, mainly because of the lack of institutional capacity at the local level. And since then, there has been significant investment in institutional capacity building programs, mainly to support the acquisition of knowledge and skills by policymakers, by civil servants, by local stakeholders like the Chambers of Commerce, other intermediaries. And as a result, there has been a significant turn of the page in which there has been, the last decade, amazing dynamism. And it's now been just a few days ago, on the 30th of November, it was hailed as one of the examples to follow by the Financial Times. So if we go to the next slide, and I can conclude, given the concluding remarks, what we have is that if we go, like we have done, or you have done in the case of the Ukraine, for a bold and very important administrative reform, in which you have done a very difficult part, which is amalgamate subnational tiers of government, merge in order to create units that are more viable from an economic perspective, you have not done the whole job. You have just done, again, as Natalia highlighted, the first step. What you need to do now is go beyond that. And in order to make sure that even the best and more carefully designed development policies actually work, you need to invest in improving the institutional environment in which these policies, these interventions are pursued. What does this imply? That you need to first acknowledge that there's an institutional problem, and that this institutional problem at the local level needs to be tackled. And how can these be tackled? Mainly by actions that are necessary to mitigate and minimize the potential of institutionally related failures. And this includes, first and foremost, investment in capacity building. Providing the technical capacity, the administrative capacity, the financial capacity to agents in local governments and even at regional governments to make sure that they can design, deliver, and deliver efficiently public policies. And reducing institutional bottlenecks that very often are going to be linked to lack of transparency, lack of accountability, lack of participation, and corruption. There's an important need to integrate institutional reforms and capacity building initiatives into the local economic development approaches that this reform of local government has allowed in the Ukraine. This would make the most and provide the opportunities to mobilize all the advantages that decentralization can offer to increase the quality of living and the well-being of citizens wherever they live across the Ukraine. And next slide, and thank you very much. And I'll be very happy to try to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Professor. It was a very interesting presentation, and thank you very much for recognition of success of decentralization and regional development reforms in Ukraine. And European Union has strongly supported these reforms since the very beginning. And now our flagship programs, You Lead with Europe, and implemented by GIZ, and OECD projects supporting decentralization in Ukraine, are working very actively with the government of Ukraine and with local authorities supporting implementation of the reform. And of course, we have questions for you. We have many, but we are unfortunately limited by time, so we will do our best. So my first question is, now we are supporting preparation of investment projects, and You Lead launched a countrywide initiative, and now they are in the final process of selection of the projects, and they will support local authorities to develop projects of regional significance for investments. So my question is that despite all challenges of decentralization, can we say that administrative capacities of amalgamated communities are stronger with regards to investments, with regards to public investment projects? And if yes, could you please give us examples of empirical evidence at the international level? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Natalia. I think that's a very important question. I mean, I have highlighted in my presentation the advantages and pitfalls of decentralization, and when you put it on the whole, the advantages are greater than the pitfalls. But what I want to highlight, is this the amalgamation the way forward? And one of the problems that at the local level that many countries have is that they have territorial units that are far too small in order to actually implement policies that are viable from an economic perspective. It's not that they not only don't have the right level of, let's say, investment or the right dimension of investment, is that they also are too small in dimension for the importance of or the needs of economic development. This is why in many countries, and I can think about the Nordic countries, countries like Sweden, countries like Denmark, but also countries like the UK, in recent times, I'm talking about a period of about 40 years, have implemented significant reforms of local government that included, as in the Ukraine case, greater amalgamation. And this has facilitated the creation of much more efficient units, going from what were underbounded units in economic terms to units, territorial units, administrative units that match to a far greater extent what is known as functional economic regions. So that is regions in which economic activity is more or less self-contained. So in that respect, the Ukraine is following a path that has been well trodden before in many parts of fundamentally Western Europe. And as a result of that, it is in a much better condition to address the local economic development bottlenecks that many parts of the Ukraine face and that before couldn't be adequately approached because of the very small size of Ukrainian municipalities.
You know that Ukraine has a new administrative territorial map now, and of course our government is investing a lot in improving the quality of institutions and building new institutions. So my next question is, you are claiming in your presentation that decentralization does not necessarily improve public investment if institutions involved are subpar. Could you please tell us what institutions do you have in mind that would require a special attention of the Ukrainian government? And what would be your advice to increase capacities of preparing substantial investment projects and make them adequate for funding? Thank you.
Okay, so what are the, thank you very much, Natalia, for the question. So what are the type of institutions that need to be taken care of? Well, there are certain dimensions of institutions. The first one, and I would insist on this, you need to improve, like it is the case in many parts of Europe, elsewhere in Europe, the quality of local governments. It's been often the case that the level of training, the skills, and the exposure to more modern systems of local civil servants can be significantly improved. And this is something that needs to be invested, and this idea that there's a need to invest in capacity. And this can be done not just by training and courses, but also by facilitating the mobility of civil servants to places where they are far more advanced in, let's say, implementing different forms of government. Like, for example, I highlighted the case of Estonia and how efficient Estonia has been in implementing a government that has facilitated transparency, participation, and accountability, and therefore greater efficiency. A second dimension would be on issues regarded or related to transparency and accountability. How can you facilitate at the local level mechanisms and systems that are far more transparent and accountable? And the third one would be dealing with corruption and dealing with issues of corruption that are rife in many parts of Europe and actually represent a significant bottleneck. And here there's a need to create a mixture of a carrot and stick, create incentives that prevent the temptation for decision makers, for participants from being corrupt, but also making sure that there's a stick to punish those that are flagrantly corrupt. If you do that, another institution that needs to be improved is the whole idea of trust. Because if you have more efficient, more transparent, less corrupt local governments, citizens and stakeholders, economic stakeholders, are going to trust more the policies, and they're going to collaborate more, they're going to participate more. So you end up in creating this ecosystem in which you have far greater capacity to actually implement more efficient and better policies. But how can this be done? And this is not something that is the burden of the local authorities. In order to achieve that, you need coordination at all levels. And you need horizontal coordination, in which local authorities that are now amalgamated collaborate in order not to compete on a zero-sum type of competition or a pure waste competition with other local authorities in the Ukraine. You need collaboration within the local authorities, within the amalgamated municipalities, in which you give voice to civil society, to economic stakeholders, to social stakeholders, and of course, to decision makers. And you also have to collaborate vertically, in which there's a need to have clear mechanisms at the level of the Ukrainian state in which you integrate and you create the system through which you link what is being done at the local level with what is being done at the regional level. And in turn, all that is actually connected to the objectives of economic development for the whole of the country.
Thank you very much, Professor Rodriguez-Pazet. It was a very interesting presentation. Thank you for your advice. And we sincerely hope to see you in person in Ukraine when the situation allows.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Natalia. It was my pleasure, and I hope to be able to go to the Ukraine as soon as possible.
And let me thank you on behalf of all our virtual audience. I believe that they really appreciated that you shared with us your research results, which are indeed very interesting and very practical for Ukraine. And with this, it's my pleasure to pass the floor to the moderator of the conference, Pani Nina, будь ласка.
Дякую, пані Наталя. Дійсно, була дуже цікава лекція професора Лондонської школи економіки Андреаса Родрігеса-Позе про те,
Thank you, Natalia. Yeah, the presentation of Professor Andreas Rodriguez-Poze from LSE was extremely important as regards particularly what has to be done in Ukraine. But we are close to the recess time until 11:15, and then we will hear more. Thank you. Enjoy your coffee.